Welcome to Uninvited, the show where we cover news that matters to Ontario women. On this program, we're talking about the highly controversial Highway 413 project. The 59-kilometer highway would cut through protected areas of the Greenbelt, rip up acres of Ontario's most fertile farmlands, cost taxpayer billions, and increase greenhouse gas emissions by millions of tons, all to save commuters a mere 60 seconds. We take a hard look at who this highway is really being built for. But first, here are some recent headlines. Ontario is the latest jurisdiction to drop vaccine passports and most capacity restrictions. Premier Ford says it's because of key health indicators, but the province isn't ready to part ways with masking for now. Dr. Karman Wong, Ontario's top doctor, says that will be reviewed only after this latest round of reopening. On vaccine passports, which were first implemented in September, Dr. Moore says they have, quote, served its purpose. It was also announced that boosters would be made available to those 12 to 17, provided it's been 6 months after their second shot. At least 300,000 fewer surgeries were performed since the pandemic began, and doctors say it'll take years to clear the backlog, requiring not just more money and more resources to add more operating room hours, but a total rethink of how Ontario provides surgical care. Dr. David Gomez, who's a trauma surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital, told the Toronto Star that he thinks it'll take at least 5 years to clear the backlog. He said, quote, unless we redesign surgical care in the province, many Ontarians are not going to get their surgeries. There's going to be a significant impact to people's lives, but also to their mobility, fertility, and quality of life. It appears Doug Ford is slamming the door shut on Brampton's request not to have a highway run through a planned new neighborhood in the city's northwest corner. City Council asked the province to have Highway 413 be a boulevard through the area rather than a highway. Now, the city was planning a new neighborhood development in this area called Heritage Heights. But Brampton South MPP Praveen Sakaria told the Brampton Guardian the Ford government is, quote, committed to making this a 400 series highway. And that is the focus of today's program, the highly controversial Highway 413 project. It's been labeled by critics as a highway to nowhere. So let's take a look at what the Ford government's signature project really means. The 59-kilometer highway would cut through 400 acres of the Greenbelt. It would rip up 2,000 acres of Ontario's most fertile farmlands, connecting Vaughan through to Caledon, Brampton, and Halton. And then the highway would tear through forests and wetlands, putting watersheds and wildlife at risk. The National Farmers Union, they've warned that the highway will mean further loss of already dwindling farmland in southern Ontario. The highway would add 17 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and environmental critics are calling the project a devastating blow to our environment. The project would also cut through the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations territory and impact their physical and cultural landscape. The Ford government refuses to provide cost estimates on the project, leaving taxpayers in the dark. Industry estimates peg the project somewhere between $6 and $10 billion, but that doesn't include the extra $1.5 billion the extra pollution will cost us. Even Ontario doctors have joined the opposition to Highway 413, citing health consequences as a major concern. In 2016 alone, 6,600 people died in Ontario due to air pollution. With Toronto's air already 3.2 times above the World Health Organization's air quality guideline, Dr. Millie Roy of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment fears that building another highway will lock in negative health and environmental effects for generations to come. And while Doug Ford says this is needed to end gridlock, it just doesn't hold up. Expert modeling suggests the highway will reduce commutes by a mere 30 to 60 seconds. So if it's not for the communities or for the commuters, who is this highway really for? The recent Friends with Benefits investigative report in the Toronto Star paints a disturbing picture of those who stand to gain from this project. 8 of Ontario's most powerful land developers own thousands of acres of prime real estate near this proposed route, 4 of whom are connected directly to the Ford government. The value of those lands could rise dramatically if this highway is built, paving the way for big developers to build residential and commercial properties or sell the land off along the route to the highest bidder. Everyday Ontarians have everything to lose from this project, while Doug Ford's developer friends have everything to gain. If Highway 413 moves forward, it'll have shattering repercussions on our neighborhoods, our green spaces, and our health for decades to come. My guests today are Lana Goldberg, Ontario's Climate Program Manager at the Environmental Defense, and Jenni Le Forestier, a member and spokesperson of the grassroots group Stop the 413. Both Lana and Jenni believe that the Highway 413 goes against everything Ontario should be striving for in the future. Through their organizations, they've identified innovative ways to spend this construction budget on things our communities actually need, like public housing and public transit. They believe this is a call to arms for Ontarians to step in and publicly oppose this project before it's too late. Jenni, Lana, thank you so much for joining us here on Uninvited today. Maybe we could just start by you guys telling us a bit about yourselves and the organizations that you've been working for around Highway 413.
Yeah, so I work for Environmental Defense. I'm the Ontario Climate Program Manager, and the highway is one of our campaigns in Ontario. We also organize around gas plants and other issues, climate policy in general, but this has been our focus in the last few years.
And how are you involved?
So I'm one of the grassroots organizers. I'm a resident in the northwest part of the GTA in Caledon, and I've been involved with Stop the 413 for about almost 4 years now, and very concerned about the impacts to my community and also in the greater sense to the province.
Okay, so Jenni, tell us how you first got involved in stopping the 413 and why the community is concerned about it.
So I first got involved in 2011. I attended one of the very first meetings in a swanky hotel in Vaughan, and with some of my neighbors, and we went to this community meeting about the highway. And the first thing I noticed was that the materials that they were giving out at that meeting had a picture of Forks of the Credit Road, which is very close to where I live. And but I knew that was nowhere near the proposed route. So it set off some alarm bells in my head, like, what is this highway, and how is this going to impact my community directly? And then, of course, the more I found out about it, the more I knew how much it would. And so slowly started to do some research about it. And then through the pandemic, many community members started meeting online and started just collaborating and checking our notes and starting to get organized.
Okay, and from your organization's perspective, what are some of the big concerns around 413?
Our biggest concerns are environmental, obviously, and they include the fact that the highway is going to pave over wetlands, forests, some of the most productive farmland in Ontario, a chunk of the Greenbelt, which we ought to be continuing to protect, and also the fact that the highway would lead to an additional 17 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at a time when we need to be bringing emissions down.
So the government has framed some of the opposition as NIMBYism, that people need to build highways in order to commute and to use their cars. What do you say to that?
So what I see is that the highway is being used as a way to unlock a lot of lands along the Greenbelt, lands that would have been protected if we still, had a government that believed in the Greenbelt. And instead, what we're seeing is a lot of ministry zoning orders that are being approved to enable the highway being built. So that is a huge impact. But also, they've tried to put us in silos as far as a rural city divide on who is concerned about this highway. What I see is neighbors in the 905 are very opposed to losing that access to the Greenbelt, to woodlots, to streams. There are people that live in Mississauga and Brampton that want access to nature. And the highway is really becoming an equity issue for those people to get to those spaces.
So let's say this project goes ahead. What does that mean to our environment and to people in that community? What will it mean?
For us, for those of us that are already dealing with a lot of aggregate extraction, it's a threat to our water supply, it's a threat to our private wells. But more than that, there's been several species at risk, endangered species, that have been identified along the route, woodlots, streams, rivers. So it's a loss to our biodiversity for everyone. And I think it's a loss of some of the natural heritage that I think we've all grown to appreciate in the Greenbelt.
People living along the highway would experience increased air pollution, which has negative health impacts.
I think there's a reason why people were so upset when Doug Ford was caught, right before the election, talking about gutting the Greenbelt. There was an outcry, and I don't think that's changed. So I think for us, it means, we have to double down, and we really need to get the local government and municipal government, provincial government, federal government to recognize that the 407 sits right there. It's 10 minutes away, it's empty, and it could solve congestion tomorrow.
We've seen some actions by the minister that's involved on this file that appear to seemingly muzzle groups like yours, Stop the 413. Have you seen that? What's been your experience?
I think there's been some attempt, but then, when we look at the fact that it's become an election issue, they sort of blew the door wide open because the media has really grabbed onto this Stop the 413 movement. We've been fortunate that many local councils have come out in opposition, and that is how we were able to get a federal environmental impact assessment request in. We have had some pushback, definitely. I myself had our local Stop the 413 signs taken from the community, even though they were on private property. Local bylaw officers came along and decided that they would help themselves and take those signs down. And that was illegal because they are freedom of expression, and they were completely in compliance.
So Premier Ford has a number of taglines that he campaigns on, that he likes to say. One of them is that he's fighting for the small guys. So is that apparent to you in a situation where a community like yours is fighting to stop a highway?
It doesn't feel very apparent. I can tell you that locally we had a mayor's virtual breakfast that local businesses were apparently invited to. It turned out many local businesses were not invited. They were told that the meeting was virtual, but many ministers appeared, including Premier Ford, to this breakfast. They talked about the 413, while many residents were standing outside with signs that said, "Stop the 413" and "Stop sprawl" and "Save our water." So I don't think that the agenda is really for the little guy. I think the agenda is clearly for corporate interest.
And I guess I would add, so there was this expert panel commissioned by the previous government that concluded that there were essentially no benefits to building the highway, that there were better ways to move people, more efficient ways to move people that were less damaging. And so regular people aren't going to be benefiting at all. In fact, we'll be on the hook for billions of dollars, between $6 and $10 billion for the project, and not actually benefit from it because, we won't be saving time on the roads, there will be more congestion. And so it doesn't appear at all that this is for, ordinary people. It does seem like the project is intended to increase the amount of land that's available to developers to develop.
So you've kind of touched upon how the government has, not listened to the community. In terms of the environmental concerns, do you felt that that's been something that the government has heard and is paying attention to?
The government seems intent on moving forward with the project despite the local opposition and despite disagreement from a lot of the residents in the GTA and the 905. I think they see this as an important part of their platform to help developers make more money along the corridor of the highway. And they're not really taking into account environmental issues. And they're also not acknowledging that the highway wouldn't even resolve congestion, which is their main argument for building the highway.
So you mentioned something called Minister's Zoning Orders, MZOs, and that's kind of been tossed around a lot. And basically, it just means overriding the will of municipal councils, of other organizations to go ahead with things. Well, how is that problematic?
So, for instance, we found an application that is south of where the route is being proposed that came to council in Caledon, and it turned out that it was for an e-commerce warehouse. And at the public meeting, we were told that the highway was legislated, it was a done deal, and that this kind of development was appropriate because this highway was going to go through. And even in the developer's applications, you could see the highway sketched out through the materials. So it turned out, this application was fast-tracked, and next time it came to council, they were suggesting a minister's zoning order, which means that it's an unappealable application. So the community really had no time or chance to make a comment.
You mentioned trying to fix the issue of commute times. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because if you're building a highway, the assumption is it's going to amount to quicker commutes for people. Is that going to be the case here?
The government claims that there would be a savings in time traveled in the region, but according to an expert panel commissioned by the previous government, there would only be a 30 to 60 seconds time saving in the region. And that's because when a highway is built, more people use the highway. It's a very well-known idea called induced demand. You build highways, more cars are using it, and it leads to the same congestion that supposedly is being addressed by the new highway. So it's not going to help with congestion at all.
So in terms of the price tag then, it's billions of dollars, right? We don't know how much it's going to cost actually because it's not been disclosed yet, but
like a conservative estimate I think is between 6 to 10 billion, and we think it's probably more than that now, but that is the conservative estimate.
Yeah, and is there better ways that money could be spent that could help more people than taking 30 to 60 seconds off their commute time?
Yeah, there are tons of alternatives to building this unnecessary and destructive highway. The expert panel that was commissioned by the previous government came forward with some recommendations in 2017. Some of those include expanding or extending existing highways, which would have less of a damage on neighboring communities. They've also suggested making Highway 407 available to truck drivers and subsidizing that to allow the highway to be used more frequently. And I would add to that we ought to consider buying back Highway 407, which was built with public funds, and now it's a company that's profiting from that. And while it's not even being used very much because the tolls are so expensive, so very few people use it. But then the most important alternatives, I think, are building public transit systems so that people can get out of their cars and have convenient and affordable public transit, that they can get to places that they need to go. We've actually looked at 7 options for rapid bus transit and rapid rail and GO expansions, and we found that if we were to build these 7 projects, we would be able to move 3 times as many people as the highway would, and the costs would be comparable.
Well, any thoughts on why then, if you've got all these other options, it's not going to really save that much time paving over all this green space, lands that are for farms? Why do you think the government is going ahead with it full force?
I think the answer is that this is a highway for private interest. There was a fabulous article that came out in the Toronto Star several months ago about who really benefits on the 413. We know it's the same developer names that keep coming up with a lot of the minister's zoning orders we were talking about as well. So land that is adjacent to a highway is worth much more than land that is sitting there, as part of the White Belt. But what's being forgotten is that that land is actually Class 1 soil. It is a finite, non-renewable resource. So the planning to pave over it and allow that land to be unlocked is not looking forward to where our food supply will be coming from in the next 50 to 60 years. So we're losing farmland at an incredible rate right now. Some of the numbers say we have 2% left in southern Ontario. Now we're looking at 100-kilometer swath across some of the best prime farmland in Ontario. It begs the question, what for? And the answer isn't great. The answer is it's for private interest. It's not for you and I.
Well, now that you bring up farmland, we've kind of seen inflation being a real issue for families. It's increasingly evident on our household grocery bills, for example. So when we're talking about taking away farmland, could that have an impact on things like food prices?
Absolutely, and especially if you're increasing that impact by encouraging e-commerce. So we're importing food for private e-commerce rather than growing food locally.
I think we ought to be focused more on supporting smaller farmers to produce food that we need locally. And so instead of getting rid of the farmland, and we've already lost so much farmland, why not aim to use it in a way that would be beneficial to the local communities?
So what do you think people should do? What can be done? What do you think should be done moving forward?
I think it's important to write to your MPPs and your MP and let them know how you feel about the highway. What we found is the more people know about it, the less they like the idea. And so we need more people to write to their elected officials and let them know that they don't support it.
And I guess I would add that all the other major parties have committed to canceling the project if elected.
I think there's lots of ways we could be spending $10 billion, including our education and our health systems. I worry as a mom that my daughter has not had a safe school in 2 years. I'd like to see some of that money and infrastructure go into education rather than another highway.
If you were to pave over something like the Greenbelt, how could that ever be reversed or taken back?
I would say that there's no ecological benefit to paving over the Greenbelt, and once it's gone, it's gone. And people don't remove development; they only develop. So, it's a very concerning proposition that 60 kilometers could be gone in 3 years' time.
Paving over the Greenbelts will not be able to be reversed because we'd be paving over wetlands and farms and streams and forests and all sorts of ecologically sensitive areas. And that's why this is such an important decision, because it can't be reversed. We can't suddenly decide in a couple decades, this was a terrible mistake. And so that's why we really need to think hard about what kind of future we want for Ontario, for future generations now. And we need to take these things into account. We can't just be thinking about, what is good for developers right now. We really need to be making collective decisions based on what is good for residents, what's good for the environment in the long term.
Jenni, Lana, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for tuning in to Uninvited. This has been Working Ontario Women News. It's time for a segment that we call I'm Speaking. It's where we want to hear from you, your voice, what you want to say, your concerns, your frustrations. Send us a 60-second message at actwow.ca. Now, I'm speaking.
I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
in.
I'm speaking.
Have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
in.
If you don't mind letting me finish. I'm speaking.
Good morning. My name is Ellie. I am a nurse, an RPN. I work within a mental health unit in a hospital setting, as well as I work in the community with palliative clients. My concerns today are a couple of things. One, within the hospital setting, safe nursing ratios. I believe that should be something that should be implemented here by the government. Across the board, long-term care, hospitals, community, everything. As well, hearing about a nursing shortage. I believe we have a nursing retention issue, and part of the reason is because we are tired, we are burnt out, we are exhausted.